his invitation to look forward to your talk.
Thanks, Marco. It's a pleasure to be here. I know that my talk is being taped, and but Marco told me that it can be edited afterwards. So all my errors and my mistakes and my accents are going to be erased by some nice overdubbing. Okay, the topic has been up for a while, so I don't need to reiterate it. This is a list of some of the people who collaborated on the papers we'll be talking about. And this is my plan for the talk. I will give a very brief review of theories of acquired dysgraphia. Then I will move on to current models of the spelling system. And then to the neuroanatomical correlates of spelling and future developments. Okay, to start, early investigations just focused on the relationships between writing and speech. So the big question was, can writing be damaged independent of damage to speech, and or vice versa? Of course, in these cases, to answer this question, critical evidence was gathered from patients with so-called pure agraphia. That is, patients who could not write and yet could talk normally, or almost normally. The problem is that the question was so broad, so general, that answers were inevitably extremely limited. So some people, when they talked about writing, referred to the knowledge, the abstract knowledge that we need to set in motion in order to be able to write, whereas others focused on the graphomotor, on the gestures that we need to make in order to write letters. And others referred to both. So the initial debate was highly controversial simply because there were lots of questions, but the overarching question was too broad to be open to a really simple and straightforward answers. The first case of pure, so-called pure agraphia, pure motor agraphia, that is referred to the motor aspects, the graphomotor aspects, was by Pupil in 1884, and he described a subject, interestingly, who could write and transcode between upper and lower case with his left hand, but not with his right hand. And of course, with his right hand he could copy normally, but could not write. This case was reported on by, was reconsidered by Lorch and Barrier in 2003 in a paper in Brain and Language. So this case shows historically, the first dissociation between impaired writing and spared speech. The first report on the reverse pattern was provided by Hubert von Grachai, I don't know how to pronounce his last name. His subject could not name objects orally, could not perform spoken naming of objects, but could write the names of the same objects normally. And as you can see in his model, he's basically assuming that there is a distinction between motor speech images and written word images. So he is assuming a distinction between writing and speech. Now, the issue has been debated for a very long time, and given that, first of all, writing was not a very popular skill, was not a widespread skill, and also because there were relatively few observations, and there were relatively few centers interested in this kind of issue, even very famous people said things that don't strike us as being particularly smart. So, for example, one of our giants said that there is in no way a direct path from the concept formed by sensory images to the motor writing center, a path by which writing movements would be activated upon the mediations of sound images. This is totally wrong. It's been repeatedly proven a few years later, obviously, that this statement is simply wrong, that the abstract knowledge that we use when we write is independent of the knowledge that we use to talk. So let's forget about what he said and what he wrote. But his thought is well captured by Lichtheim, who in his famous paper moved from this well-known house-like model to this different system where he added this E center, that is the motor writing center. As you can see, it cannot be activated from semantics directly. You have to go from meaning to speech, and from speech to writing. All you can do with written words is to read and write, to copy without thinking. In other words, you have direct connections between the orthographic center for visual images and the writing center for motor images. So this is basically how the whole thing went on for a while. Charcot had his thoughts on la graphie et la phasie de la main, but he described, even though he said that basically la phasie de la main, as though they were the same thing, aphasia and agraphia, actually he described a Russian soldier who could speak Russian, French, and English, but who after his stroke could read in all languages but could write in none. So basically he reported on a dissociation, even though it didn't in his writing strongly believe in these dissociations. Dysgraphia is another historical author, here with his critical wife, Augusta Klumpke. He basically assumed that there could be a pure alexia, but he thought that there could be no pure agraphia. If you have damage to the angular gyrus, you have alexia, but cannot have alexia with agraphia, but you cannot have pure agraphia without alexia under any circumstances. And he localized the critical area in the angular gyrus. I'll come back to this later on in my talk, because the issue of the angular gyrus of its role in reading and writing has been taken up several times with very contrasting points of view. Probably the most influential historical author is Sigmund Exner Richter Darevart, very famous guy. Here you see him in his, I would say in his youth. 167 autopsies later, he sounds really somewhat fed up. But he, in the meantime, he's analyzed 4 brains of patients who had agraphia and who suffered from damage to the middle frontal gyrus. Of these 4 subjects, only 1 had selective damage to the frontal gyrus, to the middle frontal gyrus, this subject. And unfortunately, this subject was agraphic and aphasic. However, given that he was the first scientist to consider agraphia as such, he's basically gone through history as being the first person to identify a specific neural substrate for agraphia, that is, the posterior portion of the middle frontal gyrus, which is indicated by the arrow in the bottom part of the image. Exner, the evidence provided by Exner has been criticized and praised by almost an equal number of scientists, and even those who did not believe in Exner's conclusions, like for example Bastian, ended up including the posterior middle frontal gyrus as a critical area for writing. Now, just to make a long story short, we know for sure that when we write, we use a different set of knowledge as opposed basically to what we do when we talk. This has been repeatedly demonstrated directly in patients with brain damage. So in 1997, there was a flurry of papers on this issue for some strange reason. And this is a task where subjects are shown with a picture and they are asked to say and immediately afterwards to write, or to write and immediately afterwards to say the name of a picture. And this is the subject we tested. When shown with trumpet, he said orchestra and wrote trumpet. When shown mustache, he said mustache and wrote beard. When shown fork, he said spoon and wrote knife. In consecutive responses, so there was no time interval. The fact that 2 words can be activated at the same time in response to the same picture conclusively shows that you use different sets of information when you write and when you talk. And this can be schematically captured by this kind of schema. Various authors wrote on the idea that writing and speech are or are not autonomous. We can divide them in right, wrong, and halfway. This is the list of good guys, bad guys, and some guys in between. But this is a very rough kind of subdivision because, for example, Wernicke in his 1905 paper hinted at the possibility that, after all, there could be some form of dissociation, and the same was true for Desjardins in his 1914 book, etc., etc. And for example, Bastian did not believe in Exner's data, but he said that reading and that speaking and writing were totally separate. The case of Gordinier has been the subject of a tumor in the posterior portion of middle frontal gyrus, and Ekan thought that that was the only case that convincingly showed dissociations, and Gershwin wrote against the evidence provided by Gordinier, saying that it was totally unconvincing. So basically, the whole thing was really, really confused and confusing. Then attention basically moved from individual cases to the study of populations. So the next question was basically no longer if writing and speech could dissociate, but rather there were attempts at defining writing as part of the general disorder of language. So the studies that are subsequent to those I told you about were focused on the correlations or lack of correlations between agraphia and various aspects of aphasia, or between agraphia and damage to specific brain areas. But again, what was at issue was writing as such. No attempt to subdivide writing in its components. Here are some examples from Monakov, divided everything based on that association with different forms of aphasia. Henshin was more interested in seeing which forms the occipital agraphia, angular agraphia, temporal agraphia, parietal agraphia take. Others had somewhat intermediate positions. This is one of the last classifications provided in the literature, and that's Mercier and Ekan, 1979. And as you can see, the interest lies in the associations between agraphia and other language or cognition disorders, or on pure agraphia and so-called right hemisphere agraphia that Mercier, the French school, and also Gershwin mostly associated with confusional states. However, when it comes to trying to understand what is wrong with these patients and how the brain relates to their disorders, how writing abilities correlate with the brain, we have to go back to the basic principle of expressed by Wernicke. What we find depends on what we look for, and the subtitle of his paper is a psychological study on an anatomical basis. That is, to look for the neural underpinnings of writing, you have to have an idea of what writing is about, how it's made. I mean, which components of writing are at work when people actually write. So we go to the so-called fabulous 70s and 80s and 90s. That is a time when, prompted by similar studies on dyslexia, people started to work on dysgraphia. The cognitive approach led to formulate rather specific hypotheses on the functional architecture of the writing system in all its forms. So I won't bother you with the details of how we got to that point, but the emphasis was placed on the functional architecture of the writing system, and detailed models were built, basically. Now, I will very briefly go through these various stages, because then I will try to see which areas of the brain correlate with each of these components, which are tied to each of these components. We write not only words that we know, that we're familiar with, but also words that we hear for the first time. Nape, I think, is a known word in English, but if I tell you write nape, all of you are going to be able to come with some reasonable spelling. How do we do this? We do it via the so-called phoneme graphing conversion. Phoneme graphing conversion is a set of rules that simply takes, it's a very stupid machine. It takes a short phonological segment or very short set of phonological segments and converts it into plausible spellings. When it's damaged, the functional consequence is that the subject will still be able to write words, but will no longer be able to write to dictation pseudo-words. Because to write those pseudo-words, this system is absolutely necessary. Another component, what happens when you have to write words that we know? We need what we call an orthographic lexicon. The orthographic lexicon is an orthographic long-term memory that stores our knowledge on the spellings of words we know. We need this to write words. We need it because if we are presented with this picture and we are asked to spell its name or to write its name, we have to use knowledge that has nothing to do with how that word sounds. We have to write C-H-O-I-R. We don't have to write Q-U-I-R-E. So that's why we need an orthographic lexicon. What happens when the orthographic lexicon is no longer working? That is, what happens when we have to write and yet nothing is activated in this component? Well, we can still write, but we have to go through this mechanism, the so-called phoneme graphing conversion. But this mechanism is blind to lexical knowledge. So if we ask the subject, write choir, that subject might write Q-U-I-R-E, for example, or some other plausible spelling. These are called phonologically plausible errors, or PPEs. On top of that, because the lexicon is sensitive to psycholinguistic dimensions such as frequency, the subject will be able to write high-frequency words, will still preserve knowledge, will still maintain knowledge of high-frequency words, but will not be able to use, to spell low-frequency words. So we will see two features. One is a frequency effect, and another feature is phonologically plausible spelling errors. Now, the number of spelling errors, the form they take, will depend very much on languages. It's a language-specific feature. English is the ideal language to study this component due to the opaqueness of the relationships between orthography and pronunciation. Italian is a very poor language because we have only an extremely limited number of words that contain ambiguous spellings. Korean is even worse. But I mean, this component is necessary because it specifies spellings. Why do we spell choir as C-H-O-I-R? Well, because that's what the vocabulary tells us. And this is why we need this component. That's not enough. So we spell, in order to spell unfamiliar words or stimuli that we hear for the first time, we need phoneme graphing conversion procedures. And to write to dictation or to write in response to a picture a word we're familiar with, we need to be able to activate a long-term information in the vocabulary. However, there is an important fact, namely, when we activate a word, we activate the whole word, we activate the whole sequence. When we write, we cannot activate the whole sequence. We can transcribe one item at a time. Given the phenomenon of co-articulation, so the equivalent of co-articulation, we can sort of squeeze two letters into one sign, but still, if we have to spell rhinoceros, we activate rhinoceros, but at the same time, in order to spell it correctly, we need S to remain active until we're finished spelling rhinoceros. So we need what's been called a graphemic buffer, an orthographic working memory component that must keep that that string of letters active until later processing stages are carried out. This is the so-called orthographic working memory, graphemic buffer, orthographic buffer. I mean, different people have called it different ways, but this is what it means. In other words, it's a short-term memory component that holds orthographic strings for the time it takes for them to be transformed into the following stage. So there is a contrast between the long-term memory that we need to spell words we're familiar with and the orthographic working memory component that we need to transform those words into actual spellings. In this case, the errors will be very different because this component will come into play at a later stage, that is after the word has been selected in the orthographic lexicon. So frequency will have no effect. Transparency or opaqueness of a word will not have an effect. Length will, because this is a working memory component. Short words can still be spelled correctly, but long words are spelled incorrectly in proportion to the number of letters they contain. And from a qualitative point of view, all the writing tasks will be affected. I'm talking about writing tasks because oral spelling, written spelling, typing are equivalent in the sense that they, in order to be able to spell orally, to write or to type correctly, we need an orthographic lexicon, we need phonographic conversion, and we need an orthographic working memory. In the case of damage to an orthographic working memory, where is the damage? What do the errors look like? The errors look like this. These are errors from Italian. You see that the letters are substituted, they are inserted, they are omitted, or they are exchanged or shifted, moved to different positions within the response. There is a strong, very strong length effect that affects both word spelling and non-word spelling to the same extent, but in the absence of semantic and lexical effects. So to wrap it up, this is the model we're working with. I mean, this is the model that we consider to be critical. These are the components that are considered to be critical for spelling. What this basically represents is the fact that if we have to write a word, we either in response to a picture or in response to spoken input or in response to a mental state, we must activate its meaning. The meaning activates the abstract letter sequence that corresponds to that word, which is then placed in an orthographic working memory component until following stages, converting that letter, the abstract letter, into its corresponding name, C-H-O-I-R, or into a series of graphomotor sequences, letter C, then letter H, then letter O, etc., etc., or typing that guides our finger movements on the keyboard. And then phonographic conversion if what we are asked to write is a pseudo word. Now, some of the components of this system are exclusive for writing. We only use for writing the orthographic lexicon, the phonographic conversion, and orthographic working memory. Remember that for these each of these components can be selectively impaired, and that there is abundant evidence from brain damaged subjects, and damage to any of these components will affect to the same extent all the tasks below, that is oral spelling, written spelling, and typing. Now, for the time being, we are still focusing on oral spelling and even more on written spelling, but the future could be could probably force us to study more typing abilities, because, for example, in Finland, this is taken from The Guardian in July, in Finland, schools are no longer having handwriting classes, and handwriting classes are not compulsory in 43 states in the US, because now there are tablets, there are smartphones, there are keyboards, so handwriting skills are no longer considered to be critical. So we probably, discover in a while the real meaning of opposing thumbs, because I mean apparently this is what they're for, and the sense of life could be probably clearer to us and give us unexpected opportunities. But I mean, joking apart, I will focus on mostly written spelling. Okay. Now, this is what emerged from studies in cognitive neuropsychology. These are careful studies on individual subjects diagnosed in extreme detail. However, these are all the results of individual studies, studying subjects who suffered brain damage and as a consequence of that brain damage basically showed highly selective damage to the writing system. However, at this stage, that is the fabulous 70s, 80s, and 90s, we had a lot of interest for the functional architecture of the writing system, but because the analyses were based on individual studies, we couldn't use that evidence to correlate those components to underlying neural substrates. So there was some, I have to say that, I mean, this is a good excuse, but I mean, actually, the real truth is that the brain was almost considered to be an accident in all this. I mean, what was really relevant was only the fact that following brain damage, someone couldn't write or make spelling errors only as a function of the length of the to-be-written string. Actually, there was more to this than that. And so basically now, with the tools we basically gathered from studies on single cases, we are going back to the neural evidence. We're going back to the data from the brain that might tell us and teach us something about how the brain is organized and how these components are represented in the brain. And one of the ways of doing it, I mean, I would say that the best way of doing it, if you're looking at it from the brain damage perspective, is to do it with stroke patients. Working with stroke patients can be a pain in the neck. It is a pain in the neck, but it also has very clear advantages. First of all, because a stroke may selectively disrupt components of the writing system. In exceptional cases, brain damage will only affect one component only of the writing system. In rare but less exceptional cases, brain damage can affect a single component of the writing system in the context of a more widespread of multiple damage to other language components. But as long as the analysis is focused on components that are typical and exclusive of the writing process, one can still proceed. Now, in these cases, however, the diagnosis is usually slow. I mean, you get there by approximations. So it is crucial that the patient be stable during the time window needed for the study. And to do this, strokes are most certainly preferable to dementia and also to tumor or to other, traumas could be okay, but traumas are generally associated with diffuse axonal damage, so you don't really know what you're dealing with. So this approach, studying patients with stroke, has distinct advantages. It also has disadvantages, of course, because lesions are usually large and huge, so that in the end, when you go and try to overlap lesions, you're never quite sure that the areas that you see them because of the laws that govern the vascular tree. That is, you can damage a branch of the anterior branch, I mean, a small branch of the anterior branches of the middle cerebral artery, but if you damage a larger branch, you will have damage that necessarily will affect several areas. You cannot damage area X without damaging contiguous area B. So, I mean, this is really one of the big problems with these lesions. On top of that, there is variability in the vessel distribution, so that occlusion of the middle cerebral artery or of the posterior branches of the middle cerebral artery will have different consequences in different subjects. So I mean, there are advantages and disadvantages, but the possibility to work with patients who are very stable, in whom you can make a confident diagnosis and you can rule out alternative diagnosis, makes it worth the while, as I hope I'm going to be able to show you in a minute. The components I will be trying to identify are Orthographic Lexicon and Orthographic Working Memory. If I have time, I'll go through phoneme-grapheme conversion procedures, and I'll go back to Exner if I have time at the very end of my talk. The first study I'll be talking about is a comparison, is a contrast between the neural underpinnings of long-term orthographic memory and orthographic working memory. We studied individuals with brain lesions. There is a lesion here, even though you cannot see it really well. And all these had acquired dysgraphia subsequent to neural injury. Most of them, with two exceptions, had strokes. Two had a tumor resection. And they were diagnosed as being instances of damage to the vocabulary, so damage to the orthographic long-term memory, or as instances of damage to the orthographic working memory. The first group of subjects performed very poorly in spelling low-frequency words and made phonologically plausible spelling errors. They spelled choir, Q-U-I-R-E, and they spelled high-frequency words proficiently but made errors on low-frequency words, thus pointing to damage to the lexicon. The second group of subjects, those with orthographic working memory deficit, showed no such effects. The only effect that constrained their writing performance was stimulus length. Short words correct, long words incorrect. So this is basically a reminder of the error profile in vocabulary, orthographic long-term memory patients and in orthographic working memory patients. The question was, given that there are distinct spelling profiles, are there also distinct neural substrates? These are the participants. This is a joint study between Johns Hopkins and us, co-authors with me and Rita Capasso are Brenda Rapp, R.J. Hillis, and Jeremy Purcell, 25 subjects. These are their main features, and they were categorized independent of lesion site. In other words, when we started, we were totally blind to where the lesions were. We just identified, we picked 25 subjects who had the purest clinical profile that we could get. We didn't shoot at getting 25, of course, but we looked at patients with pure damage, and we came up with 25. 16 with pure damage to orthographic long-term memory, 9 with pure damage to orthographic working memory. Let me skip that. We did the usual thing to identify the lesions, then we overlapped lesions with the voxel-based lesion symptom mapping. These are the results for the orthographic long-term memory group. As you can see, there are two clear foci where there is a maximum overlap. One is frontal and one is temporal occipital, mostly on the inferior surface. What is interesting, there are 16 subjects, 9 subjects have lesions here, but not here, 7 subjects have lesion here, but not here. Anatomically, this makes perfect sense because these lesions are in the territory of the posterior cerebral artery, whereas these are in the territory of the middle cerebral artery. But still, what is interesting is that damage to distant, distinguishable, clearly distinguishable areas of the brain can result in damage to the same component. And this raises a series of questions I'll come back to afterwards. As concerns patients with orthographic working memory disorders, here is the overlap of the lesion. There is a clear maximum of overlap in the intraparietal sulcus with lesions that are relatively widespread. What I mean, the highest density, 8 out of 9 subjects had lesions that basically are concentrated in the inferior, in the intraparietal sulcus. At this point, we contrasted voxel by voxel the lesions. In other words, we looked voxel by voxel as to whether there were voxels that were more frequent, significantly more frequently impaired in patients with lexical damage as opposed to patients with orthographic working memory damage, or vice versa. And these are essentially the results. These areas show that significantly are impaired significantly more frequently in patients with lexical damage, and these areas are significantly more frequently impaired in patients with orthographic working memory damage. So basically, there are some interesting issues that emerge from this study. First of all, the fact that there is a distinction, there is an anatomical distinction between orthographic long-term memory and orthographic working memory. There is essentially no overlap in terms of significant frequency of damage to a given area. Then the other component, the other aspect is that, as I just said, the damage to the lexical orthographic knowledge results from lesions in 2 very distinct foci, a ventral temporal and an inferior frontal site, and that orthographic working memory is damaged as a consequence of lesions in the intraparietal sulcus. There are some issues for discussion. Before I go on with the discussion, the interesting thing is that on the right you see the results of a recent meta-analysis of fMRI studies of spelling, and as you can see, the main lexical and short-term memory, working memory activations, essentially, I mean, they do not exactly coincide, but they're reasonably close to areas that are most frequently activated during fMRI studies. So that there is a good reassuring convergence of neuroimaging and lesion data. As regards the individual aspects and the individual foci, well, we cannot say if these 2 are totally distinct or if these are really distinct or if they are part of a broader area. Certainly this area and this area are completely separate. The data on the ventral temporal damage in patients with lexical damage is interesting in the light of studies on the visual word form area, because basically in terms of Tadarac coordinates, the area critical for writing is just anterior to the area that has been reported as critical for visual word form processing. Now, whether this corresponds to approximation in the measurement or whether this reflects different ways to access orthographic knowledge, we cannot say. But certainly, the 2 areas are extremely close, so there is a relationship between the 2. There is evidence for the involvement of frontal structures in orthographic processing, as you can see. What is the role of these regions is not clear yet. There is this hypothesis that has been put forward by Thompson-Schill and then repeatedly considered by people like Harvey, for example, according to which Broca's area, the inferior frontal gyrus, is not so critical for syntax, grammar, morphosyntax, as it is for the selection of items from among competitors in the same category. So this area could be critical for example, selecting words, selecting word forms among various alternatives, or it could be critical for selecting letters while writing a word that has been selected already at the level of the visual word form area. Of course, I mean, this is only a possibility that will have to be evaluated more carefully in the future. As concerns the interparietal sulcus, this is extremely intriguing because the left interparietal sulcus has been repeatedly activated in working memory experiments on functional MRI, and it has been involved in a visual and spatial and orthographic working memory. Now, what is damaged in our subjects? Is it some specific orthographic knowledge, or is it just a spatial, visual working memory component? There are data, for example, data by a friend at the Paris group, suggesting that this area could process specifically orthographic information. There is a very recent paper by Carreras who showed that the interparietal sulcus could code letter position in reading. We have evidence consistent, compatible at least, with the idea that these processes are specifically orthographic. For example, we measured the Corsi blocks, which is a very simple-minded task that is a measure of visual memory, visual spatial memory, and that has clearly nothing to do with orthography. And we saw that the orthographic working memory span was identical in subjects with working memory damage and in subjects with long-term memory damage. So it's not the case that these subjects spell words incorrectly because they have a general visual spatial damage to memory component, to working memory, but it's because we believe these subjects have a specific impairment of an orthographic buffer, an orthographic working memory. So the conclusions are these. There is a neural distinction between orthographic long-term memory and working memory. Long-term memory is fractionated in several components. We identified two at least. And the critical locus for working memory appears to be the interparietal sulcus. There have been attempts at identifying the substrate not just of orthographic long-term memory and orthographic working memory, but also of phoneme grapheme conversion procedures. It is a history of failures because any attempts at looking at the neural regions that were impaired in patients with phoneme grapheme conversion damage have been much less than successful. So I will show you an aborted attempt on our part that stopped before running into trouble for no reason. These are patients, these are all Italian-speaking patients. In yellow you see their performance in spelling words, and in blue you see their performance in spelling non-words. In all cases the difference is highly significant. What is being matched is performance on words and pseudo-words of comparable length. So I mean all the other parameters have been matched except for the fact that these are items represented in long-term memory and these are novel words. Actually they're non-words, they're selected in such a way as to not to coincide with any words in the Italian vocabulary. We try to, as you can see, there is no correlation between performance on words and pseudo-words, so the subject has a very poor performance in writing pseudo-words, whereas this subject, whose performance on words is similar, has a much better performance. So I mean that there is no correlation, as should be in patients with phonological agraphia. We just stopped after the first attempts because all the lesions are in the territory of the middle cerebral artery but are very heterogeneous. Some of them are prerolandic, other are posterolandic. Some of them are suprasylvian, some of them are below the sylvian fissure. Some of them are almost only superficial, some of them are almost entirely deep. There is no way we could find any reasonable overlap. Similar to other previous cases in the literature. There are studies by that. There are actually, these are not studies, these are book chapters, mostly by Stephen Grabchak and Paige Beeson, that show several fMRI slices, and basically their conclusion is damage is perisylvian, but we cannot localize it. Now, there is a silver lining to negative studies as well. Lesions are in the middle silver artery territory without systematic anatomical correlations. This is not strange. In order to spell to dictation a pseudo word, you need to hear it, analyze it from the acoustical viewpoint, then phonемically, then you have to convert phonemes into graphemes, then you have to place the graphemic sequence into the buffer, etc., etc. So it is obvious that damage in subjects who cannot spell non-words has to be heterogeneous. And unless one is able to tell apart one type of damage from the other, it's very difficult, and it's almost impossible to find coherent neural underpinnings. On the other hand, that's the silver lining, the neural substrate of phoneme graphing correspondences seems to be distinguishable from that of orthographic long-term memory and from that of orthographic working memory, which is nice. In many cases, the left superior temporal gyrus was at least in part damaged, which suggests that cortical auditory processing may play a substantial part, a substantial role in the errors that these patients produce. What remains obscure is the crucial issue, namely the nature and the neural underpinnings of the phoneme graphing correspondences per se. Now, I promised that I would go back to Exner, and I will very briefly go back to Exner. This is a recent study, not terribly recent, but reasonably recent study of 12 subjects with tumors in the middle and inferior frontal gyrus. They were stimulated in the middle frontal gyrus region or in the middle plus inferior frontal gyrus region in 6 subjects. Direct electrical stimulation to the posterior portion of the middle frontal gyrus, the so-called Exner's area, resulted in pure agraphia. Again, we are back to 1800. These subjects write slowly, their letters are ill-formed. In some patients, writing stops. So it's very hard to understand what is really wrong. I mean, what has been interfered with due by stimulation. Whereas subjects with, in whom direct electrical stimulation was delivered to inferior frontal gyrus areas on top of middle frontal gyrus had the same type of agraphia plus some additional language deficits. Now, just to wrap it up, we now have the theoretical tools. We can go back to the brain slowly, because the study I told you about on long-term memory and working memory took approximately 15 years. I mean, picking those 25 subjects took 15 years. We understand more about some critical neurofunctional correlates. Where are we now? Are we on the right track? Well, I think so. Have we identified some critical neural substrates? Yes, absolutely. Can we be satisfied? I don't think so. And the reason I don't think so is that we've been treating orthographic working memory, orthographic long-term memory, as though they were indivisible. Basically, orthographic working memory is orthographic working memory, period. That's not true, because, for example, if you look at the reports in the literature, in the literature on cognitive issues, you see that patients with orthographic working memory impairments are very heterogeneous. Some of them have selective difficulty with vowels, others have difficulty with consonants, and others have difficulty with both. In some subjects, there has been a selective difficulty or a selective sparing of geminate letters. In other subjects, the error type distribution, that is, the relative percentage of substitutions, insertions, omissions, and transpositions, is very different. And finally, the error distribution is very different in the string. In some subjects, errors tend to be more frequent at the center of the string, whereas in others, errors tend to increase monotonically with the distance of a given letter from the beginning. So we are focused on basically on a component of the system, but how this component, when damaged, can yield these different patterns is something we still have to understand. So it's for those of us who are old enough to have seen lots of patients, as Marco said, but who feel young enough to feel the need to study and learn, there is still a lot of work to be done before we can say that we really understand things. And what I said for the orthographic working memory also applies to the orthographic long-term memory, because damage to the vocabulary can selectively affect nouns, it can selectively affect verbs, it can selectively affect high frequency, low frequency items depending on various subjects. It can selectively affect some word types, some verb types as opposed to others, etc., etc. So there is a work out there on which we still have to work. Thank you.
We've got time for questions.